Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins, and today we want to begin our journey through the historical books of the Old Testament, and we want to look at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Joshua is a book that was written primarily by Joshua. He wrote, obviously, parts of the book. That's mentioned in Joshua 24, verse 26. But it was an unknown person who seems to have compiled the book into its final forms, taken kind of Joshua's raw material and then worked it together into the final form of the book that we see today. And this is written, therefore, to the nation of Israel. It's written in the land of Canaan, where they have now crossed the Jordan River, as we learn about in the book of Joshua itself, in order to conquer that land. And it would have been written around 1300 to 1400, maybe the final compilation of it a little bit later than that, but still over 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, what's the main idea of the book? God gave Israel the promised land and calls them to serve him in the land. So that main point, that verb, gave, God gave Israel the promised land, and now they have an obligation to serve him in that land. Now, the book breaks down into four primary parts. Chapters 1 to 5, Israel crosses the Jordan River into the promised land. Chapters 6 to 12, God gives the land to the nation of Israel. Then chapters 13 to 21, God divides the land among the nation of Israel. And then chapters 22 to 24, Israel is called to serve God in the land. So I want to focus again on that verb give or gave. God gives Israel the promised land. So the book of Joshua is not about Joshua's superior military strategy, like we should look at the things that Joshua did and we should study them for military excellence and then be able to imitate them. The point of the book is not that Joshua was really a great general. The point is that God did a miraculous thing in giving this small nation, the nation of Israel, the land of these mightier, more powerful nations. We see that in Joshua 24:13, where God says, I gave you a land. I gave you a land that you did not labor for, and cities you did not build, though you live in them. You are eating from vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. So even the Canaanite prostitute Rahab, who we read about early on in Joshua chapter 2, recognizes from the beginning that Israel itself and its general and its army is not a true threat. It's the God of Israel that is a threat. She says in Joshua chapter 2, verse 9, I know that the Lord has given you this land. So we see this especially in the most famous battle in the book of Joshua, the very first battle that God sets up intentionally to teach the nation of Israel this lesson, that it's not your power, it's not your might, it is God who is going to give you the victory. And what battle was that? Well, maybe you remember the song from being a kid. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, right? So they cross and they are immediately met out on the other side of the Jordan River with the most powerful city in the land of Canaan, the city of Jericho, with these immense defensive walls. And what does God do? God tells them to actually not fight. He tells them to march around the city for 6 days, and then on the seventh day to march around 7 times, to blow the trumpets, to yell, and then God's going to give them the victory. And that's exactly what God did. They walk around, they yell, they blow their trumpets, and the walls fall down, and they win the battle. They win the city. Not because of what they did, not because of their fight, but because God did it. And so God is saying, this is what I'm doing in this entire land. I'm fighting for you. I'm giving you the victory. And therefore, because God gave them the land, They are called to obey God in the land. They are called to get rid of all other idols and worship God and God alone. So Joshua, at the end of the book, gives Israel this challenge. Put away your idols, put away your false gods, and serve the Lord your God alone. But Joshua also predicts in Joshua chapter 24 that they're not going to be able to worship the Lord because he's a holy God, he's a jealous God, and the people of Israel are going to disobey God. Now, one of the troubling parts of the book of Joshua, of course, is that Israel goes in to kill the Canaanites and destroy the Canaanites. So why does God command Israel to destroy the Canaanites? How can we explain that such a command comes from a God who is a merciful and loving God? This has been quite troubling to many people, that the people of Israel are called to go in and kill the inhabitants of the land. Now, how do we understand this? First, we have to understand that God is the creator and king of all places and all peoples. The Canaanites, just like the nation of Israel, just like everyone in the world today, as the creatures that God created, owed God worship. But instead, they worshiped idols and they lived wickedly. And just as God destroyed the entire earth in Noah's day because of their sinfulness, and just as God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in Abraham's day, God had every right to destroy those who disobeyed him and rebelled against him among the Canaanites. Second, God often used, in the Old Testament history, he often used other nations to execute his judgment. So the nation of Israel is God's tool in God's hand to execute his just judgment against the Canaanites. And in the same way, later, when Israel is under God's judgment, he's going to use the Assyrians and the Babylonians to execute that judgment as well. Third, God also shows mercy to those Canaanites who put their faith in him. So the first example of this is Rahab, the prostitute, who shows her faith in the God of Israel. Even though she's a Canaanite, she's what? She's saved from judgment, and she's incorporated into the people of Israel. Later, there would be this whole tribe, the Gibeonites, who are Canaanites, who come to the nation of Israel in Joshua chapter 9, and they put their faith in the God of Israel, and they are incorporated into the nation of Israel. So we see here that God has every right to punish sinners, and God, as a merciful God, also shows mercy to those who turn from their sin and put their faith in him, even among the Canaanites. So will God ever issue this type of command today, where one nation should obliterate another nation? And the answer is no. First, God no longer gives us this type of prophetic revelation that he gives to Joshua that he did in biblical times. There is no prophet today that could give us the command to destroy another nation. Second, and more importantly, we live in a different part of salvation history. God's kingdom has come in Jesus, and God's desire is now to include all nations in his people through faith. So the command today would never be to destroy another nation. The command is to proclaim the gospel so that the nations can be saved. So as we come to the end of the book of Joshua, we see that God has a plan for his people to bring them into a land where they're going to experience his blessing, live in his presence, see all the promises to Abraham fulfilled. But that doesn't come to place after the book of Joshua. As we're going to see in the book of Judges, they're going to sin. That sin problem is still there. So we actually need a greater Joshua. And the name Jesus in the New Testament is the Greek form, Jesus. It's the Greek form of the Hebrew name Yeshua, Joshua. And so Jesus, quite literally, is a new Joshua, a greater Joshua, who has given us a greater rest. He's brought us into God's presence, not just in a land where we will fail and be exiled, but he's destroyed the power of sin within us so that we can enter into God's very presence in a new creation. The book of Judges just picks up where the book of Joshua left off, and it tells the story of how Israel failed to take Joshua's advice to worship God and be dedicated to him alone. We don't know who wrote the book of Judges. Possibly, it was Samuel, who, of course, we read about in 1 Samuel. And if it was Samuel, then it was written in the land of Canaan about the year 1000, so 1,000 years before the coming of Jesus. And the book of Judges tells about a 300-year period or so, 400-year period between the death of Joshua and the rise of the kings Saul and David. And this gets to the main point of the book. The main point is that Israel needs a king, but not just any king. Israel needs a king who will lead them to keep God's covenant. So the book of Judges splits into three main parts. Chapters 1 to 3, Israel begins to rebel against God. Chapters 3 to 16, Israel's rebellion gets worse and worse. And of course, there are all these different judges that we read about in the different parts of the book. And as we read, we keep in mind that things are getting worse and worse for the people of Israel. Then chapter 17 to 21, Israel reaches the fullness of their rebellion. So there's a cycle that we see in the book of Judges. Israel sins. God disciplines them by bringing another nation to oppress them. And then the people cry out to God and God delivers them. This happens again and again and again. Sin, discipline, crying out, deliverance. And at that deliverance point, that is when God sends a judge to deliver them. In fact, if we think of the judges as people who are sitting in a robe saying a person is guilty or not guilty, then we're not getting it. The Hebrew idea of a judge here is primarily a deliverer. This is someone who will deliver the nation from oppression. And yet, we start with these judges that are fairly good people, but quickly we see a downward spiral. Think of a screw as that spiral goes down and down. So that sin, discipline, crying out deliverance, it's not just a circle, it's a spiral going further and further down. So the early judges like Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, they're portrayed primarily as righteous deliverers of the nations. But there are later judges like Gideon and Samson who are seen as sinful themselves. So Gideon, he promotes false worship in Israel after he delivers Israel. Samson is totally consumed with himself and idolatry and pursuing women and all of these things. And so he is seen as a very sinful person himself, and yet God still is using him to deliver the nation of Israel. But by the time we get to Judges 17 to 21, the author is giving multiple stories that illustrate that Israel is basically as bad as it can get. There's examples of their idolatry, of Israel's sexual immorality, of murder, even of civil war in the nation of Israel. There's comparisons with the nation or the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Israel is seen as even worse than Sodom and Gomorrah in the things that they are doing. So instead of living as a holy people in the land, they've become as wicked as Sodom. They've imitated the nations that came before him. They are worse than the Canaanites. They have drifted as far away from God as they possibly can, and they've drifted away from the peace and prosperity of the kingdom of God that he intended to bring about. And so 4 times in the book of Judges, in chapter 17, 18, 19, and 21, the author says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him." And this is where we see Jesus in the book of Judges. The fact that there was no king and Israel needed a king. That on their own they could not escape the cycle of sin and judgment that they were in. They needed a king who would lead them to be faithful to God's covenant. And of course, in the book of 1 Samuel, we see God giving that king, but the king they need is a king like David, a king after God's own heart, a righteous king who loves God. And that kind of king wouldn't just deliver the people from oppressive nations. He would be able to deliver them from the oppression of sin itself. The king would change the hearts of the people and lead them to keep God's covenant, securing them in God's place forever. Finally, let's talk about the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is one of only 2 books where a female is the main character of the book. The other would be Esther. The book of Ruth, we don't know who wrote it, but it's written probably around the year 1000 or 900. And it is focusing in on a story that is occurring during the time of the Judges. And the main idea of the book is this, that God cares for a family and brings about the birth of his chosen king through that family. And each of the 4 chapters of the book gives a different part of this story. In chapter 1, we meet Ruth, who is returning to the city of Bethlehem with Naomi, her mother-in-law. Chapter 2, Ruth is gleaning in the fields of Boaz. Gleaning is picking up the wheat that has been accidentally dropped in the field as they're harvesting the field. Chapter 3, Ruth asks Boaz to redeem her. In chapter 4, Boaz marries her and has a son with Ruth. So one of the most beautiful things in this book is that Ruth actually is a Gentile. She's not from the nation of Israel. She's from the nation of Moab. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot had an incestuous relationship with his daughter, and from that comes the nation of Moab. And in fact, the Moabites were not allowed to worship in the temple because of that incestuous origin of their nation. However, Ruth professes faith in the God of Israel, and she says to her mother-in-law Naomi, "Your people will be my people, your God will be my God." She's putting her entire faith in God and in his relationship with the nation of Israel. And as a result of her faith, she is brought into the people of God, an example of how later God will incorporate all the nations through faith in Jesus Christ into his people. We see in this story how God is controlling all things for his glory and for the good of his chosen people. So Ruth is married to the son of Naomi, and Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons had went to the land of Moab to escape a famine in the nation of Israel. And there the sons married and they lived for a time, but the sons die, the husband dies, and what's left is Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws. One of her daughter-in-laws, Orpah, decides to stay in Moab with her family, but Ruth decides to trust in the God of Israel and become an Israelite by joining Naomi as she goes back to the land of Israel, back to the city of Bethlehem. And as they go back, they find that God has already prepared the way for them to be taken care of and to have descendants that will come from them. So there's a sense in which everything in the book of Ruth it's just happening. It so happened that this happened and this happened. And what we're drawn to see is that it's the hand of God himself that is putting everything in the right place so that Ruth's life can be rebuilt and so that a descendant can come who's actually going to be the one to bring about salvation for the entire nation of Israel. God gives Ruth a redeemer in the man Boaz. Boaz is a close relative. He's one of what was called the family redeemers under the covenant law of Israel. So a family redeemer was responsible to redeem the land of a dead relative in order to keep that land in the family. So God had divided all the land of the promised land between the different families of Israel, and that land needed to stay in that family so that all the families of Israel would equally be prosperous in the promised land. So one of the ways that they were to do this is if there was a relative who died childless, the closest relative of the husband would produce an heir with the widow who would be the heir of the land so that it stayed in the family. And God prepares this man named Boaz to be this redeemer, to save Naomi and Ruth from destitution, and to bring about a descendant who will take the land and continue the family line. Now, what's interesting is that this descendant is Obed, who would have a son named Jesse, who would have a son named David, who would be king, who would bring about Jesus Christ. What we're seeing here is how God, in this incredibly unlikely way, takes a Moabite woman, not even an Israelite, he brings her, he protects her, he cares for her, ultimately, so that through her, even in the time of the judges, even when all this wickedness is happening in the nation of Israel, God still has his people and God still has his plan to bring about salvation, not just for Israel, but for all the world, to bring about a king in the line of David through Jesus Christ.